I would like to welcome on behalf of Amma and on behalf of Pravasi Leader Cell, Mr. Jose Abraham, a reputed lawyer from Supreme Court of India, and also he is practicing High Court of Kerala. We are extremely happy to have him with us today, and I give him a warm and happy welcome to the seminar.
Thank you, sir.
I would like to welcome Anitha Nainan, who has got a dual licensed attorney, admitted to practice in the state of Georgia, and she is a certified lawyer, admitted to practice in India also. We are very happy to welcome Anitha Nainan, who is an eminent personality in Atlanta. Welcome, Ms. Anitha.
Thank you.
Yes, we also have our sponsor, Mr. Prasad Pilipos. He is the brain behind this event, and I am extremely happy to welcome Prasad Pilipos to this seminar.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our executive committee of AMMA. All the executive committee members heartily welcome to join this webinar. Yeah. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Joseph.
Dominic, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you just mention about Ram? He sent in a note saying that due to an emergency situation, he could not attend. So can you just let everybody know about that?
I understand Mr. Ram Cherath, who was supposed to join us today. He is a reputed remediation attorney from New York. He was supposed to be with us today, but due to an emergency family event, he has to go to India yesterday. So he expressed regret for not able to attend this Zoom meeting, and he is absent today. So let me invite Mr. Advocate Jose Abraham to the stage to give his keynote address. As I said, he is a Supreme Court, a lawyer in the Supreme Court of India and practicing High Court of Kerala. He is also a global president of the Pravasi Leader Cell. He is hailing from Kochi. We are extremely blessed to have this eminent and a reputed personality as our keynote speaker today. Let me invite him to speak his ideas on the current legal issues that we Pravasis face today and what are the solutions for it, especially on the subject on land protection, buying and selling of properties, Aadhaar and PAN card requirements, property taxes, tax payments, etc. So let me welcome our keynote address speaker, Advocate Jose Abraham, to do his address. Welcome, sir. Let me invite you.
Thank you, Mr. Dominic Chakonal.
Yes.
Good evening and namaskar, one and all. First of all, let me thank the organizers for arranging this webinar on the topic expatriates and legal issues. I would be very happy to interact with you all and address your concerns rather than making a long speech. So you are free to ask questions in Malayalam or in Hindi, and you can straight away ask, or you can type questions in the chat box so that I can address your concerns. Friends, for the last 15 years, I'm dealing with various issues of expatriates. And one of the major issue or major query which I'm used to get from United States is related to transaction of properties. Transaction means buying and selling properties. As far as a citizen of India is concerned, it's a legal right, it's a fundamental right. He can buy, he can sell property, there is no problem. But once somebody emigrate to a foreign country, then naturally his status of his citizenship slowly changes. He can be an NRI, or in some cases, especially from US, people used to obtain OCI card. So that means once they obtain the citizenship of a foreign country, as per the Indian Constitution and as per the Citizenship Act, somebody obtained a citizenship of a foreign country, naturally he ceased to be the citizen of India. And then if expatriates interested, they can obtain OCI card also. Then what are the difference between an NRI and an OCI card holder with regard to buying or selling of their property in India? As I told, every citizen in India, he can buy and sell property. There is no restriction. But somebody has changed their citizenship, then there are certain restrictions. We know that many of our people, especially those who are migrated to United States, they obtained US citizenship. Naturally, they are no longer the citizens, but their ancestral property, their property may be there in India. And moreover, they would prefer to buy properties in India. So then what is the law says? The law says that an OCI card holder, he can buy property except agricultural and plantation property. He can buy all other kinds of property. There is no restriction. Similarly, he can sell their property. There also, for selling the property, there is no restriction as such. Only restriction is related to the transfer of money from India to a foreign country, including US. There is a restriction. The law says that he has to obtain the permission from Reserve Bank. So that's only a restriction. Otherwise, buying and selling properties are concerned, there is no restriction except agricultural and plantation property. That's only a restriction. Secondly, today's topic specifically says about the requirement of Aadhaar card and PAN card for OCI card holders or NRIs. So here, let me also just classify what is the difference between an NRI and an OCI card holder. NRI means, it says non-resident Indians. It only says that he is an Indian citizen, but if he is not residing not more than 182 days in a financial year, then naturally he is deemed to be considered as a non-resident Indian. But he is retaining the citizenship of India, and all the other rights are concerned. There is no difference. But OCI card holder is it means naturally a person who ceased, he is not an Indian citizen, and as and when he acquired the citizenship of any other country, then if he wants, he can get OCI card. OCI card is a document which is issued by Government of India for the it can be otherwise it is termed as a permanent visa to India. If somebody migrated to a foreign country, and naturally if they obtained the citizenship of that country, then they are no longer treated as an Indian citizen. So then if they would prefer to come to India, then they need to get the visa of India again. So for that matter, if they have OCI card, then they don't require to obtain a separate visa. And multiple entry, that option is also there. They can, and there is no restriction as such. So that is what the difference between NRI and an OCI card. Now the question is whether an OCI card holder is required to have Aadhaar card and PAN card for the purpose of transaction of property, or also for the purpose of paying income tax. Is that required? If it is so, is PAN card is necessary? Is an OCI card holder is entitled to get Aadhaar card and PAN card? The law says that here also that 182 days stay is the key. If somebody is staying in India for more than 182 days, then naturally they are supposed to they can get Aadhaar card, and naturally if they are supposed to pay tax, then Aadhaar PAN card is also required. For the last couple of months, frequently I got so many questions from OCI card holders from US saying that they have their property, and for the purpose of transaction, the registrar, sub-registrar office is demanding Aadhaar card for the purpose of registration of their deed. Here, please note that the Supreme Court of India categorically held in Justice Pattuswamy case, stating that Aadhaar card is not a mandatory document. Even though somebody is an Indian citizen, Aadhaar card is not mandatory. It's only an optional document. So that is absolutely applicable for our OCI card holders also. If some sub-registrar office or somebody is asking mandatorily Aadhaar card for the purpose of transaction of their property, for the purpose of buying, or even also for selling property, friends, please note that Aadhaar card is not mandatory at all. It is not required. It's not a mandatory document. Without having Aadhaar card, you can buy property and you can sell your property also. And if an OCI card holder is staying in India for more than 182 days, then you can apply for PAN card and Aadhaar card. That's your choice. That's also an optional thing. Yes. Now, let me talk about one important document, one useful document for our expatriates, that is power of attorney. Naturally, you may be having your property in India, or many times there are certain cases filed against you, or you would like to file certain cases in India for protecting your rights. Especially, a lot of cases are coming to the effect that the Pravasis, they may be having their property, their house, their property, it may be there, but physically the expatriates are not there. So there are instances wherein the neighbors or the other people, they tend to capture the property by just the boundary may be demolished, or some pathways may be created all of a sudden. So such kind of issues our expatriates are facing continuously. So in all, and there are cases, family disputes are also there. So many cases are filed. Sometimes to enforce their rights, you need to file a case in India, or in many times you need to defend your matter. If somebody filed a case against you, then you need to defend that matter in India. In all those cases, you can use this power of attorney very conveniently. Power of attorney means it's a legal document by which you are authorizing somebody on behalf of you to do that particular transaction on behalf of you. So it's a very convenient document, power of attorney. But friends, please note that whenever you are executing a power of attorney, you need to make it specific. Please mention the purpose of execution of power of attorney. For what purpose you are appointing an attorney in India. Otherwise, there are number of instances wherein the attorney who has actually been authorized is misusing that power of attorney, and they may be for the last couple of months, I myself see number of cases with regard to misuse of power of attorney, and by misusing that, they captured the property of our expatriates. So power of attorney is a very convenient document. If you want to file a case, or if you want to defend a case, you need not travel every day to India. You need not travel. You can use power of attorney as a convenient document, but always ensure that for the purpose of buying or for the purpose of selling your property, for that matter also, you can entrust somebody with a power of attorney, but ensure that you are specifically mentioning the purpose in that power of attorney. Yes. Then the other issue may be rental issues. You may be having your property, so just for the purpose of gaining some money, you may be given that your house or your other land, you may be giving to somebody for rent. That's a quite common thing. But expatriates' properties are concerned, there are many instances wherein the person who bought that property on the basis of rent or lease, they may capture that property. One important aspect we need to ensure that all the rental agreements or the lease agreements, ensure that you are registering it. Periodically, you are registering it and renewing it time to time. Otherwise, legally, there is a term called adverse possession. Adverse possession means if somebody is using a property for continuously for more than 12 years, then they can claim the ownership of that property. So that adverse possession, that by misusing the physical absence of our expatriates, and if there is no proper registered rent agreement or lease agreement, there are many cases wherein the properties, the expatriates were thrown out from the properties. So please note that if you are giving your property to anybody for the on the strength of a lease or a rent, ensure that you are renewing it, registering it properly, and renewing it time to time. Yes. Now, friends, please note that many are from Kerala, and many of our NRI friends are from Kerala, and a lot of issues are also from Kerala related to various issues. So to ensure or to protect the rights of our NRIs or our expatriates, Kerala government is having a mechanism in the form of an NRI commission. NRI in Kerala, not only in Kerala, in Punjab and in Goa, in 3 states, there are a full competent judicial authority called NRI Commission. This NRI Commission, it's a judicial body. If you face any kind of violation of your right, including a capturing of your property, or fraudulent or vexatious unnecessary litigation against you, you can give a proper complaint to this NRI Commission. You need not make any money. You need not pay any money at all. It's your legal right to ensure the rights of our NRIs or the expatriates. That NRI Commission is there. So all these kind of issues, capturing of your property, or boundary capture, or if you are not there, somebody may file unnecessary cases. If you are traveling to Kerala for 10 or 15, 30 days vacation, there are instances, if some issues are there, they may file a case, vexatious case may file against you. In all those matters, you can get the help of NRI Commission. Not only NRI Commission, if you are in a foreign country, and if you got any kind of information that somebody is trying to capture your property, then to get the police protection, in Kerala police there is a separate wing called NRI cell. So for that, for getting the protection of NRI cell, for that matter also, Kerala police is having an online website or the online facility is there. Please get the service of the NRI cell of Kerala police. With this initial remarks, I think that my time, 15 minutes, is going to be over. So I would be happy to address any of your concerns. If you have any queries, I think after the presentation of our learned friend, Advocate Anita, we would be having an interactive session, so you can raise your concerns so that I will be there to answer. Thank you.
That was very nice of you. It was a very enlightening speech by Joseph Ram. Thank you very much, sir. One question that came in the chat box was that about the power of attorney. This power of attorney, is it be an for all purpose? Dr. Stephen Potter is there, and do you like to ask that question now, Doctor?
Yes, thank you. So I'm just trying to find out if a power of attorney can be an all-purpose power of attorney, meaning it can be used for land purposes, or if anyone files a fictitious, frivolous case against you, or if there are other challenges, can it be all-purpose, or does it have to be very specific for land transactions, for purchase of property, all those kind of things? Thank you. And thank you for taking my question.
Yes. Can I answer that?
Yeah,
yes. Yes. Power of attorney, you have mentioned 2-3 instances, including to file or defend a case, for that matter, you can issue a power of attorney. That is one thing. Secondly, for the purpose of transaction of your property, for buying or selling your property, for that matter also, you can use power of attorney. Here, the only difference is that there are certain cases. If you have committed a crime in India, then in certain criminal cases, power of attorney may not be sufficient. Certain cases, your personal presence may be required for the purpose of taking evidence or to examine the witness. In such a case, your presence may be required. But most of the cases, including family disputes are there, divorce cases are there, custody of children, for all those cases, normally power of attorney is sufficient. With the support of power of attorney, you can file a case or you can defend a case. But sometimes, that depending upon that the nature of that matter, court can direct your presence. But otherwise, for the purpose of transaction of property also, you can use power of attorney. It's a very convenient way. It's a very convenient document, because you may be in a foreign country, especially in view of COVID and all, travel is very restricted. So in all those cases, you can use this power of attorney very effectively. But please note that it's not wise to give a blanket power of attorney for all purpose. It's always please ensure that if you are issuing a power of attorney, please make it for a specific purpose, so that the misuse of power of attorney can be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose, for that clarification. Now,
Dominic,
next, I would like to invite Anitha. I would like to invite Anitha Nainan, who is our guest of honor today. She is a U.S. immigration attorney, and she is practicing in state of Georgia. Also, she is certified lawyer admitted to practice in India also. She is the founder and principal attorney of Nainan Legal LLC, with well over a decade of legal experience across 2 continents. She focuses her practice on corporative and U.S. immigration laws. Ms. Nainan also advises foreign nationals on immigrant visa processing and guides them through the U.S. permanent residency process to U.S. citizenship. Ms. Nainan currently serves as the chairperson of the Georgia Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. She also serves as an honorary legal advisor to the Indian Consulate General of Atlanta. She is a member of AILA, that's American Immigration Lawyers Association, and she is vice chair of its Global Migration section. So we are happy to have such an outstanding personality with us today. I hope she will give us the latest highlights on immigration from the January 2022 bulletin, salient features of H-1B visa, scope of B-1, B-2 visas, visitor visa, and the implications of overstay. Let me now invite her to give the guest of honor speech now.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I would like to thank Amma and Dominique Chaconal, its president, for inviting me to participate in this education series webinar, along with Advocate Jose Abraham from India. We have heard a very enlightening talk from him about what we NRIs and OCI holders need to watch out for in terms of our property transactions relating to India. And I am going to now focus my presentation on US immigration and some of the key highlights which Dominique has already shared with you and which will be of interest to this audience. So starting off with the Visa Bulletin. As you may know, the Visa Bulletin is a monthly bulletin which is issued by the USCIS, which is the US Citizenship and Immigration Service, along with US Department of State. And it summarizes the immigrant visa numbers that are available every month in the various visa categories under family-based immigration as well as employment-based immigration. So very briefly, if we were to look at the 4 categories of family-based immigration, the F1 through F4, there has been no major change from the December visa bulletin. The only silver lining in the cloud is the category F2A, which is spouses and unmarried children of US green card holders. That is current as of now, which means that those who qualify can apply for a US green card. Moving on to the employment-based categories, EB1, EB2, and EB3. EB1, India, which applies to Indian professionals of extraordinary ability, multinational executives and managers, outstanding researchers and professors. If you qualify under that category, then you are again current, which means if you have a US employer who is willing to sponsor you for a US green card, your immigrant visa petition and your application to adjust status to US permanent residency can be filed concurrently. EB2, which is applicable to Indian professionals of exceptional ability and advanced degree holders. The cutoff date is 8th of July, 2013. And EB3, which is available for Indian professionals who have a bachelor's degree or skilled workers or unskilled workers. The cutoff date is 22nd of January, 2012. All of you who are familiar with the visa bulletin will know that in October 2021, just a few months ago, EB3 moved very rapidly, and it was at the cutoff date moved to January 2014, as a result of which a lot of Indian professionals were able to file their applications to adjust status to US permanent residency. Unfortunately, because of that, now that category is retrogressed, and it is the cutoff date has moved now to January 2012. Moving on, I'd like to say a few words about the US green card processing and the difficulties that Indian nationals face in terms of the documentation. Most importantly, getting a copy of an original Indian birth certificate. Under Indian law, there is an act, the Registration of Births and Deaths Act of 1969. So all births that took place before April 1st, 1970 were not required to be registered under that statute. For births on April 1st and 1970 and after, under Indian law, they are required to be registered. However, as we know, there are so many books on the statutes, so many laws in India, but they are not enforced. So you do have situations where Indian nationals born even after April 1st, 1970 do not have a birth certificate. So what do you do in that situation to meet the needs of your US green card application process? Because you must produce an original birth certificate. So I would be happy to address that during the Q&A in terms of what is a secondary evidence that USCIS will accept if you're not able to produce an original Indian birth certificate. Moving on to the H-1B program. This again is a very popular visa route for Indian professionals. Highly skilled Indian professionals can either use the H-1B program or the L-1 program, which is the intra-company transfer of employees between companies. The H-1B program allows a US company to hire a foreign national in a specialty occupation, which requires the application of a highly specialized body of knowledge and the attainment of a US bachelor's degree or higher or its foreign equivalent. This is the initial petition is filed for a period of 3 years, and before its expiration, the company can file an extension petition for an additional 3 years. So the entire period of validity for an H-1B visa is 6 years. In certain situations, that 6-year period can be extended in increments of 1 year or 3 years under the AC-21 Act, which is the American Competitiveness of the 21st Century Act, which allows such professionals to extend their time when they are progressing into US permanent residency and waiting for their US green cards. H-4, who are the dependents of H-1Bs, again, in certain cases where the primary H-1B holder has an approved I-140 or an immigrant visa petition, they are authorized to work. And otherwise, H-4s have the ability and are eligible to study in the US. It is a strict liability program. And again, we can discuss more about what are the strict compliance requirements for both H-1B employers and employees if you have to remain compliant with this work visa program. Finally, on the B1 and the B2 business and tourist visitor visa, to the US, what does it allow you to do when you travel to the US on a B1 or a B2? A B1 is a business visa, visitor visa, which allows you to travel for basically temporary business purposes, which can include things like consulting, for meetings, for participating in seminars and conventions. If you want to negotiate a contract, if you want to settle an estate, these are the kind of temporary business purposes for which you can travel to the US on a B1. A B2 is for tourism and recreational purposes. Usually, if you go to a US consulate abroad, you will get a B1 for 5 years or 10 years. When you arrive at a US port of entry, you will be admitted initially for a period of only 6 months. If you find yourself in the US and you want to extend your stay, you can file an application to extend your B1 or B2 status, and that would be extended for a maximum of another 6 months. So in all, you can legally stay in the US for a period of 1 year. If you stay on beyond the expiration of your I-94 on a B1, there are certain implications of accruing unlawful presence. And again, in the interest of time, I will address that during the Q&A. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anita. That was very inspirational. And now the question answer time is here. The first one, Mr. Eluda Ray has raised a question, and he is concerned about his F41 class visa. Eluda, would you like to enumerate on that question? Eluda. Yeah. Please say the question once more. Yes, sir. Speak. Yeah, he's asking about F41 class visa, and he has filed this one and he was waiting for this one and it has not come. From last year, January, it is with the NVC. Anita?
Yes.
So, NVC, but still not have the option to pay for visa. Could you please let us know how long it will be taken normally?
So your the F4 classification is the sibling classification, right? So your sibling sponsored you, and the cutoff date is only, as I see, it is January of 06. So when did your sibling file for you, and are you current right now, and your papers are pending at the NVC?
Good morning, madam. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, actually, it has been filed since last 2019, and now the cases is showing it's in the website. It is pending with NVC, and the stages that now it is to pay, but the option to pay it's like a hidden. So the NVC has a summary saying that as it is having numerous cases, it has been pending.
Yes. So let me just to let you know about the process. What's going to happen is right now your papers are pending with the NVC. That means they are reviewing. They are reviewing all the financial, the civil documents. I'm assuming all that has been filed, right? Now,
Yes, yes.
yes. So nothing. Only after that review is complete will they transfer your papers to the US consulate in Mumbai. Okay, but
Yeah.
the current cutoff date for this category is January 2006. Your petition was filed in 2019. You have a long waiting period before an immigrant visa number becomes available. All right.
Okay, okay.
So
Okay, ma'am.
yeah, so this
And
you know,
Ray, if you have got more questions and clarifications, you can contact Anita later on and have a private chat.
yes.
yeah, sure.
That's the
Can I
best.
have that, ma'am?
Yes, you can get my details from Dominic later.
Okay.
You can go. Yeah. Next, we have Mr. Matthew Maplet from Chicago. He want to ask a question, but he has not given the question. Matthew, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, please ask the question.
Yeah, Anita, thank you very much. So, what is the waiting period for the H1 visa? How much approved by the government, and what is the last filing date? Can you please explain regarding that?
Okay, so the H1B is really, and I did not mention that fact, it is a quota-driven visa program, which means there is a maximum number of visas that are annually provided for each fiscal year, and that is capped at 65,000 for those who have either a US bachelor's degree or its foreign equivalent. If you have a US master's degree, there's an additional 20,000 available. Now, this visa category is always oversubscribed because there are so many companies in the US who want H1B, specialized, highly skilled workers. So in a typical year, the number of cases that the USCIS gets is about 4 times that of this annual cap of 65,000. So about 270 or so. So invariably, that process, ends up like a lottery, because it's a random selection by USCIS of the petitions, which are initially go through an electronic registration process, which happens in March. Once those electronically submitted registrations are selected through that random process, only those selected registrations can go ahead and file H1B petitions. And then, of course, the H1B petitions which are adjudicated successfully are the ones who finally are able to get an approval notice, and then the foreign national goes to a US consulate and applies for a visa, and then tries to come to the US to join H1B employment in October 1st of the next fiscal year.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita. Next, MJ, I don't know who it is exactly, but he's asking about OCA card. Maybe Joseph Brown would answer. Is this OCA card is beneficial for everybody, those who does not have any residential property there? Or is it enough to have a tourist visa? That is his question. MJ,
Yes.
there? MJ?
Question is clear. I can answer that question.
Yeah.
It's already there in the chat box. Yes.
Yeah.
The answer is that having or obtaining OCA card it's not a mandatory document. It's absolutely your discretion. If you want, you can get that. If you have OCA card, then it's a lifelong visa. You need not apply a visa every time for each entry. You need not apply each time. And secondly, if you are going to India on a visa, then you without OCA card, then you need to report to FRRO. foreign registrar registration office. So that procedure also can be avoided if OCI card is there. That convenience is there, but it is not. It's absolutely your discretion. It's not a mandatory document at all. I think it is clarified.
Next question is from our Prasad Bilipos. After sale of property in India, any legal issues or processes to transfer money to US?
Yes.
So the legal,
Yes. I saw that question. So here also, you can bring the money. You can bring the money from India to any foreign country. There is absolutely no problem. But there is a small procedure is there for that matter. You need to pay the tax depending upon the classification which you belong. You need to pay the tax, and you need to get the permission also from a Reserve Bank. And then after getting the permission, you can take the money, or you can bring the money to a foreign country. There is absolutely no problem.
So how do we get the permission from the Reserve Bank? Is it through the banks? Yes. Or?
That's for that matter. Normally, the application is it can be submitted to your auditor. The chartered accountant can place that application. That application form is there with the RBI website also. You as an individual, you can apply. You yourself can do that. But if you want to get the assistance of a chartered accountant for the purpose of filing your tax, you can get some auditors' help.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
And I have one more question. I have one more question. You know, a couple who are separated in the US, okay, and if one of them or if both of them have properties in India, so how does that work? Like in the US, what I understand, I think Anita should know, should be able to help us out there. If a couple is separated in the US, typically I understand it is like 50% gets divided among the two, you know. So is it the same in India, or what is the process in India? So maybe both of you could answer this, you know.
So let me just I don't know, this is not really my area, but you know, it is not only there are different states have different rules. There are some states which are based on community property, and I think those are the ones where it's an equal division, you know, 50-50 between the couple. There are other states who will, you know, where the division is on the basis of how much they brought into the marriage, in terms of, you know, they will, you know, the court will look at, you know, the income earning of, you know, both the husband and the wife, and then determine what the split should be. So I would not say, paint with a broad brush and say that it's 50-50 across the US. It depends on which state you are in and which state law has jurisdiction over your matter.
Okay, thank you. And what about the India one, Joseph?
Yeah. In Indian scenario, the important position is that divorce is that it's a legal process. So at the time of divorce, it's a judgment. There is a decree of judgment. So in that decree, everything will be mentioned, including the custody of children, the maintenance, and also the property. So at the time of a divorce, everything has to be decided by the family court. So depending upon the decree of judgment, the property shall be divided. That is one scenario. Secondly, if the property is originally owned by two individuals, then naturally, whatever is the document says, the division and the entitlement will be absolutely dependent as per that document. The sale deed says that it's a joint ownership, then 50-50. That is what the position.
Okay. The other thing is, now you said that they will follow the decree of the family court. Okay, the divorce or the separation is taking place here in the US. So will they follow the US laws of the decree, or you have to separately file that in the Indian court and get a decree from them, or how does that work?
It's an interesting area. And a lot of disputes are also there on this count, because basically people may be Indian origin. The marriage also must have been registered in India, but subsequently they must have been moved to a foreign country. So in all these courts are actually having jurisdiction. So if both the party decided to file a petition in US, then whatever is the decision of the US court, you need to follow that. Otherwise, if both the parties selected the Indian jurisdiction and filed a case there, then the matter has to be decided as per the Indian law. You cannot, for half of the matter, you cannot select half of the matter in India and half of the matter in US. You cannot. And secondly, if there are instances wherein one party may prefer the Indian jurisdiction and the other party may file the foreign jurisdiction, then in that case, the court will verify all the which court is actually having the jurisdiction, where the marriage is originally solemnized, where it is registered, and where both the parties are residing. And depending upon that, the court will take a call. And please note that in many cases, somebody may fraudulently file a case in a foreign country and obtaining an ex parte decree. There are many instances such ex parte decrees are obtaining. As per the Indian Supreme Court judgment, if an ex parte decree is obtained by either of the party, there is no legal sanctity, there is no legal validity, there is no legal force in India. Yes.
Okay. So what I understand is, in such a couple who is separated here or divorced here in the US, it's better that they go and hire an attorney in India and follow the process, whatever is there in India. I think that would be a good decision to take, right?
It's case to case basis, but prima facie they can decide. They can decide either the Indian jurisdiction or the US jurisdiction. If they decide Indian jurisdiction, then the decision of the Indian court has to be binding on US court also. Similarly, if they decided to file a matter in US and then the decision of US court is actually binding in Indian court. That is what the general.
So supposing here in the US court, they say 50% of the property needs to go, I mean, has to be divided 50-50 among the couple. So the same law will apply in India too. So 50% of the properties also there will be divided. Is that what it is?
So for deciding that in such a way, court will see all these aspects, where what is the nature of that document, because the original the ownership of that property is based on the sale deed. In the sale deed, that means the adharam. If it says that if it is a joint ownership, then naturally it is 50-50. Here in the US court also will decide as per that only, because that document is the key thing. Otherwise, if both the party jointly agrees that no, I need only this much, and if it is a joint decree or a compromise decree, then there is no dispute later.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I have somebody.
I would like to add
this question. Yeah. Yeah, Anita, you want to add something?
No, I'm fine. No, I was just saying there's a question about a US green card matter on the chat, and I'm happy to take that if Jose, you finished answering.
Yeah, thank you for the answering the query. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a question in the chat box. If you're applying for a green card for a parent from India, can they travel to the US when the green card is in process? Or alternatively, if we apply while she's in the US, can travel back to India while the green card is being processed. Now, if your mother is in India and you sponsor her for a green card, in all likelihood, she's not going to be able to travel on a B2 to the US, because when she goes to, if she goes to get a B2 visa, she's going to be the consular officer is going to know from within the system that you have applied for a green card for her, even on the DS-160, which is the online form that has to be filled out for a non-immigrant visa. You have to declare whether anyone has filed an immigrant petition on your behalf. So if that is the situation, they will see her as a potential immigrant to the US and may think that she will travel as a non-immigrant on a B2 and then stay back in the US. So she will in all likelihood not get a B2 visa. The other scenario where she is already in the US and you file a green card application for her, that again has to be done very carefully, because again, you do not want the intent being questioned, because she came in on a B2. So there are certain rules that must be followed as to when you can file an adjustment application for her. However, if those requirements are taken care of and you do file for her while she's here in the US, she can travel back once she gets her advance parole document. And that filing is done concurrently as a part of the adjustment of status application that you will be filing for her. If she happens to travel back while that application for the advance parole document is pending, it will be deemed abandoned. And then if she leaves the country, there is no way for her to come back again to the US. And she will, in all probability, she will also have abandoned her adjustment green card application as well.
Thank you.
Are you happy, Yash?
Yeah, no, the question was good. One more question, Anita, you had said you would pick it up on the,
yes,
don't have the birth certificate.
Right.
What do you need to do?
Yeah, so there are two things. So if you do not have a birth certificate, one, you will have to produce a letter of non-availability of the birth certificate from the municipal authority or office which has jurisdiction over the place of birth of your prospective immigrant beneficiary. And along with that, you can provide alternate secondary evidence, which can be like a matriculation certificate, a school leaving certificate, which shows the date of birth, as well as parentage, both the father and mother's full legal names. If you're not able to produce those kinds of secondary evidence, then you can get an affidavit from a relative who has knowledge of the facts of the birth of the person in question. So any of these forms of secondary evidence, along with that letter of non-availability or certificate of non-availability from the municipal authority concerned, will be sufficient for USCIS for the green card application.
Thank you.
Very good. Our Dr. Stephen Potter has made a comment that if you do a sale and then to reduce the tax, you can invest on Government of India bonds for 3 years. Is it right? Is it correct, Jose?
Yes. There are different bonds floated by the Government of India. So you can put it for a period. There are different schemes. There are schemes for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. And depending upon that scheme, you are entitled for the benefit of a certain interest rate also, and tax benefit also you are entitled. That information is correct.
Very good.
Dominicata, Mr. Yash has put up his hand for some time. Can you ask him to ask his question?
Yash is already clarified.
Yeah, I already asked the question. Yeah, that was before this.
That was already answered.
I can see one more question in the chat box on rental period.
Yeah, one by Ajit.
Yes, that question says that rental period is there any specific period? As far as that rental guidelines and that rental period is concerned, there is no specific period as such. It is up to the if you are executing a rent agreement, then the landlord and the tenant, or in a lease, lesser and both the party has to agree. If it is for 1 year, then that's valid for 1 year, or it can be for 3 years, it can be for 10 years. There is absolutely no problem. The only issue is the expatriates, they may not have a written agreement or a lease. Then in the absence of a written rental agreement or a lease agreement, then if somebody or the other party is continuously holding that property for more than 12 years, then they can claim the ownership of that property by claiming adverse possession. So for that, only due to that reason only I suggested, it's always advisable to renew or to execute a written agreement, rental agreement or a lease agreement, and it's always advisable to register it also and renew it periodically. If your document says that if it has to be renewed every year, then please renew it. Or if it is for 3 years, after that period, please renew it. Or 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be, ensure that you are renewing it in time. That's only that's the point.
Yeah, that is very clear.
Thank you.
Ajit would like to know about the GC process. I don't know, it is Anidas or Jos.
Yeah, this is Ajit here. If I can just elaborate my question a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I can hear you. You can also read.
Yeah, okay. So my question is more to do with the cross chargeability in the GC process in the I-485 stage. So I understand that if if your spouse is born in a different country, which has got a shorter wait time in terms of 485, you can actually avail the benefit of our country of birth through cross chargeability. So in my case, my wife is on a H4 visa. I am on a H1B visa. She obviously she's not employed because we are not yet at that stage. So but she is an Indian citizen. She was born in UAE, but she's an Indian citizen. So can I does this qualify as a candidate for cross chargeability? That's my question.
So she is, so you are right now in H1, you have an approved I-140 and pending I-485.
Not yet. I am still in the perm process. I have not yet reached my I-140. So there's still some time for that. But I just want to know in advance whether this is something that I can, avail of at the right time.
I don't know how it's cross chargeability. Yes, you can, depending, on the country of birth. But it's something you'll have to see at that point when you become eligible as to what is moving faster, because it's it's limited by the country of birth, and each country has only that 7%, right? So you will have to see which country the line is shorter, and she can avail of it at a later point. But clearly not now. You don't even have your I-140 approved, right?
Yeah,
So
no, I understand.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I totally understand.
Yes.
I can't
Correct.
do it now. I'm just asking if the circumstances that I just explained, my wife being born in UAE,
right,
and she being an Indian citizen, not obviously she's not a UAE citizen,
right,
and I am an Indian citizen. If this qualifies as a case for cross chargeability, which I think you have answered.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else would like to? It's a very live and very successful question answers. If anybody would like
to ask one more
question, yeah.
Sorry. So talking about the power of attorney, is like, do we need to register the power of attorney at all?
Yeah, power of attorney, if you are executing it from US, then you need to get it attested from the Indian embassy or the consulate.
I'm in India.
Yes,
I'm in India. I want to sell a property. I'm giving the power of attorney to somebody else. Do I need to register it, or does it have to be just a notary public signed and it should be good enough?
It's registration is not mandatory, but there are certain instances the buyer may not be agree to purchase it on the basis of a notarized power of attorney. So in that case, it's always advisable to get it registered so that it will be having all the legal validity. If you are doing a power of attorney from India, then get it registered from the sub-registrar's office. If you are getting it executed in a foreign country, then get it attested from the Indian embassy.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Good.
I would like to add one more small aspect with the permission of host Dominic. Yes. I am actually part of an NGO called Pravasi Legal Cell. That NGO is for the purpose of empowering our Pravasi expatriates friends only, and we are working for the last 14 years. And Advocate Matthew Mafflet is serving as the country head of United States, and Mr. Prasad Philippos is also there as the coordinator. So we are there to take up collective issues, not individual issues. If you feel that any collective issue which affects our people, then definitely we can take up that matter and we can address that issue through politically and also through filing a PIL before the High Court or the Supreme Court. So please coordinate, please contact with our country head, Mr. Matthew Mafflet, or with our Prasad Philippos also. Thank you.
One more question from Mr. Abraham from Florida.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so your mother is a green card holder, and the requirements for US naturalization is, yes, she should have been a US permanent resident for 5 years. Out of that, 30 months, she must meet a physical presence test. That is, she should have been in the US for 30 months physically out of those 5 years. And there's another test called the continuous presence test, which must be met, that there is no break in her US permanent residency during these 5 years. As regards the English speaking, there is an English test and there is a civics test, which she must pass. And there are certain exceptions to these tests, but I think you have to have been a permanent resident for a much longer period, like 15 years and 20 years, to be able to avail of those exceptions. So if she does not speak English, then that's going to be difficult for her to naturalize at this stage. She must pass the English test.
All right, thank you, Mr. Nida.
Sure.
So I think we will wind up. It is well over 1 hour now. As per our schedule, we are supposed to close by 9 o'clock. Thank you very much, the keynote speaker, Joseph Abraham, and also Nainan, another Nainan, for your wonderful sharing of knowledge. And it has enabled us to understand much better about the legal issues and the immigration facts. It was a wonderful session. I would like to thank all the participants. A very big thanks from the Executive Committee of AMMA and from the legal Pravasi legal cell members. A very hearty thank you to one and all for participating with us. It was a very robust, very active, very clear, and